All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to look to get started here in covering Intacct dimension balance reports. So today's agenda, we're covering just dimension balance reports. Usually we cover a lot of ground and a lot of different reports, but we're going to do just one today. We'll go through a brief overview on what that is, and then we have a bunch of different scenarios for this one report to showcase how valuable the report can be. When I send the slide link out to you guys, I do have links to a short YouTube video about this report, and then Intacct's own help guide that gives its own instructions and explanations for how the report works. So in general, this report is used to create a summary style presentation of balances based on dimensions and account values. We're creating the result through the report wizard, basically. And because it is a dimension balance report, it is required that we include some sort of dimension that has to be displayed. And so those dimensions can be accounts, programs, checkbooks, and funding sources, which for us and the way we use Intacct, this is all required information from us. Anytime we do a purchase requisition, anytime we run a financial report, all of that has those things as that forms the basis of what we do. In addition to those, we can use the customer dimension on this report, which if you're using accounts receivable and order entry, that's a valuable area for you. We can use vendor, which of course we use in all of our purchasing activity. Employee, the employee dimension, which is different than the vendor dimension. The employee dimension, which we use with payroll activity. So we can run reports on our staff. The item dimension, that's what we use in purchasing and order entry. We don't actually use an account number. We use something called item. And the best example I can give with that is with travel. So there's a lot of us that have prepared travel probably for next week. And when we use the travel deal, we have 60100 per diem, mileage, hotel tax, all that stuff. Those are purchasing items. They're linked to the general ledger account. So when we run a financial report, we only have the one line item on our financial report. This dimension balance report allows us to report on items if we wanted to display the different items we use in cases like travel. And then of course, class is another dimension we use. Right now we're using that in purchasing, but these are all things we can use to our heart's content if we want to record our activity and make it reportable and Intacct. So these are our options, and we'll go through some of those examples here in a minute. This report allows us to choose our reporting periods. Our financial reports, they're already predetermined. We're going to get a report for a fiscal year, or we're going to get a report for life to date, meaning how long the funding source we're researching, how long that's been in Intacct. But this allows us to choose. We can choose from predetermined periods of time, or we can enter our own customer period by adding an opening or closing date. And so when we look at where we'll go for dimension balance report, which is we're going to our menu to general ledger, and then under the report section of the general ledger, we'll click on dimension balances. The top half, and just like any of the other general ledger reports, allows us to choose a reporting period. That's the first thing it wants from us. The default is current month, and the as of date will default to today. And so with this basis, the as of date gives us the baseline for how the reporting period is going to work. It says 12/9 current month, meaning it's going to give us information for the whole month of December because this date is December. If I was researching a specific month and I wanted a report for August, I change that date to August. That is going to be the current month as of this date, meaning August. So this date will control how this reporting period works. There are a lot of options in the drop-down box available for you to use. So you're free to use any of those that pertain to you or that would be of interest. And notice a lot of these are going to have two. There's current month and current month to date. So current month will give us the whole month, no matter what the as of date is. If we used current month to date and we chose August 17th as our reporting day, that means it would give us information from August 1st to August 17th. So when we're choosing those reporting periods, pay attention to if it's this thing or does it have to date added at the end. And our as of date will control how that period is working. If we don't want to use these two options, our next option is selecting an opening balance date or a closing date. So we can customize a period of time to say, I was just looking for the first 4 days of October. And by including those there, that overrides this selection. And that's how the reporting periods would work. If I wasn't sure when transactions began for a particular funding source or vendor or whatever it is we're researching, I could leave opening balance date blank and just use an end date. So this would mean the very first time a transaction was recorded until October 4th, or whatever period of time we choose. And it works the other way too, where we know that our fund, say, started October 1st, 2019. We're not sure when the last transaction is. Leaving this blank defaults it to today. So now we have all transactions from October 19 to today. So we have a lot of options just on the date alone for this report. So this doesn't give us the visibility for data that we need based on those periods. When we run the report, we're allowed to drill down through the data to the general ledger to get detail. This report gives us summary information. Drilling down by clicking on the blue hyperlinks will get us to the general ledger for the detail. This report defaults to the accrual book. This is where we record all of our balance sheet activity, meaning our cash, accounts payable, accounts receivable, when we have money due to payroll, or our revenue and expenses. But this allows us also to include encumbrances we can report on. So we can add that as the book we want to use. It'll default to combining both of those, but if we were only wanting to look at encumbrances, we could uncheck that. And that's the selected one we're going to use. So we get some good options right here on what we can report on. We're allowed to use content selection. We can choose our actual numbers. We're just looking for expenses. But through this report in May of last year, Intacct added the ability for us to include a budget or both actual and budget. So we can actually get a budgetary report from this. And we'll look at that later when I show how to do like a fiscal year report and a life to date report, which we get information back much more quickly than we would through the report center. Program users must have an account selection, program, and checkbook, and at least one dimension value to run the report. So if we're out there, we're one of the programs, we need to have that information there. And I see I forgot the K in checkbook, so I'm going to fix that real quick. So with that said, we're going to jump into starting to use the dimension balance reports. If you have questions, please use the chat box. So the first thing we'll start with is choosing a reporting period. And we'll just go with the default. When we come to the land on this page, it's going to say current month, and the as of date is whatever the current day is. So today is the date, it's going to use that. For now, we're going to stay with the accrual book, so we're not going to make changes to that. And we'll stay with just the actual data that we're looking for. We're not going to add budget or anything at this time. Next thing we need to tell Intacct, this is a required area for us, is we have to have a general ledger account number selection. We can choose from a range, which means if I wanted to research utilities, so I'll add that in this box, it'll automatically fill in range here at the end for us. So if we use that utilities as the option, then this is the only account that's going to be researched when we run the report. We can also choose a range, which means from the account numbers. So if I included office supplies here, that would mean any account from utilities through office supplies that has activity for what I'm about to prepare for the report would be reported on. So if we didn't want to include all the other information, so we know we have a meeting coming up and there's only specific accounts we want to discuss, this might be something we're doing. If we're approving budget mods and it only involves a small group of account numbers, use the range to cut off the other ones so you can just focus on the 2 or 3 that's being worked on. And so what would that look like? On this side, I have the general ledger account. So basically what we're doing with that range is we're saying any account number that's greater or equal to utilities, 68100, any account number that's less or equal to office supplies. And so by using that range, I'm selecting 4 accounts. And of course, that range can be any number of accounts you want to use. This one happens to be 4. We have the ability to select multiple accounts, so we'll do that in a minute. All accounts or an account group. So we'll come back to this. We're not using statistical accounts, so no worry on checkboxing that. No information will return for us. Now we get into the dimension area. As users, minimally, we're going to use the program and checkbook. So for today on this report, I'm using all programs, general account. If I do not include a funding source, that means every single funding source and that I have access to that would come through from all programs and general account will be reported on in this report. So if you have multiple funding sources with the checkbook and you have your program and checkbook here, leave this blank if you want to be able to report on all funding sources. If you know a specific funding source and that's what you're researching, then by all means enter that specific fund. If you only want to include the active in progress funding sources, you don't want to include stuff that's been closed or potentially inactive, in the funding source field, you can type in progress. And that will mean we will only get the funding sources that are in progress, that are currently being used to be reported back. So we're going to leave this blank for now. If we're using customer, here's our chance to add a customer. Here's our chance to add a vendor. If we were researching a specific employee, then we can choose that employee here if we were looking for payroll activity. Here's that item code from our purchasing transactions. This is where if we wanted to report on something specific, if, hey, we're specifically looking at the cost that we've spent on per diem, then we could do that. We could specify that. Or we could report on class. So we have our selections picked, all programs for general fund. And the next area we're going to have is we have to show a dimension value. If you've used the report before, it's going to remember the last selections you've had. If you haven't used it before, it's going to look like this. It's going to be blank and it's going to say select. If we tried to run the report at this point without selecting something, it's going to give you that message. Please select show dimension values. So we know we have to have something picked. Now from here, we know we're looking for multiple account numbers and potentially multiple funding sources. So when we click to select this, we get a list of all those dimensions that are listed here. We want to show by account ID, program name, all this information. What are we going to select first? So if we wanted to go by funding source ID, there we are. And then now we want to see by account ID the spend from each fund. This side is how the report's going to be ordered. So if you've used Excel to sort things by multiple columns, this works the same way. This means funding source is going to be first in how it's sorted and then the account IDs. And then we can select how this stuff is going to be presented. I think the default is to show side by side without totals. So we'll look at side by side and no grand totals here for the first run. And if you're printing this, you can choose, do you want it portrait, landscape? And if it's large enough, make sure you check to fit 1 page wide for printing so you don't get 2 pages for one report. So now that we run this report, we get a return and we can see it's an alphanumeric order by funding source first, and then by the account number. So that happened by using that in the show dimension box. And so this activity is only for the month of December. We can see right here, tells us right on the report, December 1 to December 31st. We can click on the blue values if we needed to see more detail about what might make up those charges. So if we wanted to know what day those were, that kind of stuff, we can click there. And when we do, a new box pops up for the general ledger. Go back to building this report. When we come back here to some of the presentation stuff, we can see there was no totals because everything's side by side. If we present the report as cascaded and I click view, we'll get the same information, but now we're breaking it apart. Here's that funding source and the account number it's used. There's it, subtotal. And it does that all the way down. So if you have multiple funding sources, you're going to print something. This is probably a more legible report for reading. You can see when a program's used multiple account numbers for our search here. And that goes all the way through, but we don't get a grand total. So we can always go back. Grand total is an option. Run the report again. Now at the very bottom, we have a grand total for all of that spending for the month of December so far. And so that's an option we have with range. We can use multiple accounts, which if we select this option and select accounts, we can start adding by a range of accounts or by choosing. So if we wanted to know utilities and office supplies, we didn't realize we were going to include those other ones in between. So we only wanted those two. We can do that now. We have that picked, save that. So instead of range now, we're just using those two accounts. So when we rerun the report, the output of this report's changed dramatically now that we don't have those counts that fit in between in this range. We just have the two being used. In which if we're only discussing office supplies and utilities, now we've got just those things we want to talk about. We kept funding source and account number in order, so same presentation we have. And we can still drill in for the month of December. If we want to change how this report looks, we're going to do that here on how it's presented. We can go back to side by side, or maybe we wanted the account ID first and then the funding source. So if we clear that and rebuild this, switch that order. Now we can see for utilities, which funding sources we're using that, and for office supplies, which funding sources we're using that by changing the order of the selected dimensions. So we have a lot of options that we can do there. A lot of dimensions we can pull from, including that item code. We wanted to include vendors so we know who we were spending money with. Maybe we weren't too worried about what a funding source was. We wanted to know who we were spending money with in those two accounts. So now I have vendor name. And now we can see our utilities for the month of December have all been spent with Cherry Todd, our office supplies with Turtle Creek and the post office. So certainly a lot of flexibility in how we use the report and the information we get from it. We can choose all accounts. So if you've selected that, it's going to be a very potentially a large report because it's going to be all of our revenues and expenses, all of your cash activity, all of the balance sheet account activity would potentially show up on this report by using all accounts. And the last one you can use if you have all accounts selected, if you don't want all accounts, but you want to use an account group, make sure you have all accounts picked and you can enter a group. So these are predetermined groups that already made. For example, if I typed all EXP general ledger accounts is going to give me all the expense general ledger accounts. So if I wasn't sure what to pick on the range, or I didn't want to go through and pick all these accounts one by one, I could pick all expense general ledger accounts. So there's the same thing with revenue. There's all revenue general ledger accounts, and then another one, all revenue and expense general ledger accounts, which is getting us closer to a financial report. And if you're only wanting to see payroll activity, like for example, on payday, when payroll is run and we need to know how it's posting, and particularly for like a program monitor, there's a group called payroll journal entries. And this would only show the expense accounts and the liability account due to payroll. And so you can cut off all the other stuff from your trial balance, looking at a general ledger report, that kind of stuff. That would do that for us already. So there's a lot of account groups there, but those four are probably the main ones that you would be interested in using, which is the all revenue general ledger groups, all expense general ledger groups, all revenue and expense general ledger groups, payroll journal entries. Next, we'll look at encumbrances. So if we wanted to see encumbrance activity only, we're going to come right here to where the reporting book filter area is. Accrual is automatically selected, so we can see this is blank. We need to select the encumbrance journal. And in most cases, I would recommend not to mix those two books for reporting. The balances can throw you off because it's going to include open encumbrances and your expense balances. If you're only looking for encumbrances, that could be confusing. So I have it unchecked for now. So if we wanted to go back to that same range, utilities to office supplies, we have all programs and general accounts still picked. We have account ID and vendor name. So if we wanted to see encumbrances by these dimension values, then we're ready to go. So now we know where we have open purchase orders at right now for utilities, for telephone, for cell phone, and for office supplies. We don't have the funding source included in this report, so now we're only seeing account number and vendor. So we would have an idea of how much we have or that we're currently spending in the month of December. This is not including any previous month. And we can customize that in any way for us. So if we wanted it by funding source, we'll use funding source ID. And maybe this one, we also want the vendor ID in there. So we'll do vendor ID and name. And then once again, we've changed what we're looking at just by doing this. And now with the vendor ID and the funding source added, we actually see some negative amounts out here for the month of December, which is not really anything to worry about, but it's of note. What this means is we've paid a bill in the month of December where the encumbrance was created in a different period of time. So the release happened here, but the encumbrance was created in another period. From a month-to-month basis, if we're running a report, not a big deal. But if you did it for a fiscal year and you saw a credit balance, that's a flag for us that there's a problem with our accounting, that we might have paid or closed something in a wrong period of time. All right. And as I was saying, we can use this report to build basically a fiscal year revenue and expense report. So if we were going to do that, we can choose a reporting period, which if we chose from this list, it's not going to be current year. Current year in the reporting periods literally means January to December. So if we tried that and we're trying to base this off the tribe's fiscal year, we might get some information that doesn't match. Might not have budget information or certain expenses. So just be aware of what that means. What we're looking for is the periods that say fiscal current year or fiscal current year to date. We'll go by fiscal current year. We already have encumbrances selected. So we're going to combine that with the expense book for this one. We can choose actual budget or actual and budget. So we're going to choose actual and budget. It's going to ask us what budget to include. We use the RST budget, so we don't need to make a change here. We can choose from draft budgets. And so if you were wanting to look back and see what you had proposed in other years, those are available to you. But we're going to go off the RST budget. Do you want to keep this range of accounts, or now are we ready to use all revenue and expense accounts? Well, let's try all revenue and expense accounts. And then make sure we choose all accounts so that it'll recognize our selection here. All programs and checkbook 3. Hey, we're still going to stay on this one for now. And then how do we want this to be displayed down here? We don't budget by vendor. So anytime we're going to include budget in our stuff, vendor is really not going to be a worthy balance or dimension for us. So we're not going to include vendor. We got the funding source, and we're probably going to use the account ID and name, and not the item ID. In purchasing, these aren't going to have the budgets. We want to use the account ID. How do we want this displayed? So we'll leave it as it is right now. Do we want to go budget, then actual for our columns, or actual, then budget? And we can show a difference. So we have that there. And now let's view this report. So now we've generated a pretty quick fiscal year report for the general fund. And we can see and go through there and report whatever information that we wanted to collect from. Note there's one column. So what that means is your expenses and your encumbrances are combined. So you wouldn't be able to tell what's what there, but you do get the values. So we know, like in this one here, utilities is budgeted at $99.99. We've spent or encumbered $7,500, so the budget that remains is $2,400. So a nice quick report that we can use, and something, if you're approving budget mods in particular, use that report, use the multiple accounts, and just pick the ones that are on screen so you can cut off all the other things and then get a current budget on the spot. We can also do this for the life of a program, the life of a funding source. So we know if we go to the report center and run a life-to-date report, at this point, the database is so large, most of the life-to-date requests won't run on your computer. It's either going to take a very long time or you're going to get the error message that indicates it's timing out. So we have to process and store a life-to-date report. If we're just running to do this very quickly, we can choose a reporting period called inception. We have all the same information here. And if we were going to do that for a particular funding source, we leave everything else the same. For those of us running life-to-date reports, if we did the stopwatch right now, which report would win if we're just trying to get information? This report would win. And so we've just done a life-to-date report from inception, from when we started using Intacct, through right now 2030 is the end period, but that will continue to grow as we advance. For that funding source, we get all of the budget, we get all of the expenses or encumbrances all happening in that period of time, and just a matter of moments as opposed to waiting or having to process and store. And so now if our program director was asking you to get that information, needed that for a question about what you have available to spend, and you're a program that uses life to date because you have grants that last multiple years, You're able to accomplish that pretty quick, and now you could print or email that, have that ready to go. Have a good rest of the day, guys.